Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the 75th anniversary of the Social Security Act. And this is not just the person signing a piece of paper. This is the labor movement. These are mass struggles by Americans, attempts at self-organization going back a couple of hundred years that lead to economic rights. And people have paid into this all their lives, and now these reactionary Republicans and Wall Street Democrats come along, and they want to loot Social Security. And as James Roosevelt said, Social Security did not contribute to your deficit. It certainly did not contribute to your financial crisis. Rather, you have tried to loot Social Security. So hands off Sharon Engel and the rest of these clowns and their Austrian school ideology, because behind that hides a nation of paupers, Americans in misery and poverty working for coolie wages. And it's a loser, because China is going in the other direction. China now enjoys a rising standard of living. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and those people are now rising into middle-class standards of living. So you want to compete with that, go for a high-wage, high-value-added, high-technology, high-energy, high-capital-intensity economy, and that'll give you high profits and high rates of real return without derivatives and the rest of this garbage. So low wages are un-American. We can look at Herbert Hoover's campaign speeches from 1932. He says, I don't want sweatshops in other countries with low wages and low cost of real estate and raw materials competing with high-wage American workers. This is the one point where Herbert Hoover was superior in 1932, and accordingly, we have it there. That's the whole basis of the Republican Party from its foundation until well into the middle of the 20th century, is that they want a high protective tariff, and if it's not a protective tariff, at least a revenue tariff, but not free trade. So that's the story on the Social Security Act. Now, we want to just mention something about the 14th Amendment. Now, I said last week, you look at these Tea Party characters now, their notion of the Constitution ignores about 150 years of history. They're ignoring the Civil Rights Movement. They're ignoring the New Deal in the large sense, the New Deal from 1933 up to 1968, things like the GI Bill and related progress that was made. Some progress made also as a result of the populists, to the extent that they were able to influence the progressives of the first part of the 20th century. But above all, the whole Tea Party concept of the Constitution ignores something called the Civil War and Appomattox. And again, the critique was not so much the weapon of critique, but it was the critique of arms. Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas answered these questions, and they were answered at Appomattox with a finality that only a lunatic would want to go back to look at. The federal supremacy is the order of the day. Fight at that level. Nullification, interposition, and secessionism are simply not part of the system, and you can't just go back to them as if this didn't all happen. A big curse will rise out of hundreds of thousands of Civil War graves against the people who want to do these things. But that when you start attacking the 14th Amendment, now Lindsey Graham, from the cradle of secessionism, South Carolina, the place that, they led the other states, it was a one-party state, led the Confederacy into secession, and then paid a terrible price at the end, which was predictable because it was an inferior system. He comes out and says, we got to get rid of the 14th Amendment, and we've got a bunch of other reactionary Republicans. Well, the answer to that is no. We're not rolling back the fruits of the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the fruit of this terrible conflict, and all of those millions, really, of victims that it caused. In particular, the 14th Amendment, which was put out by Congress in June of 1866 and ratified by July 1868. This is Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens, the leading radical Republican and the dominant personality at Gettysburg College. I would think somebody like Ron Paul, who went to Gettysburg College, would have some appreciation of the historical role of Thaddeus Stevens. The goal of Thaddeus Stevens was that the former slaves should have the vote and that there should be a land reform, that the estates of Confederate planters should be broken up and distributed. The 40 acres and a mule plan, in effect, which came from Sherman, but also carried carried on by Thaddeus Stevens, he could never quite get this. And this is the tragedy, because that would have solved the social problem in the South in the same way that the Homestead Act largely solved the social problem in the Midwest and the Farm Belt and the High Plains. So here it is. Section 1, 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Yes, we're for it. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. We're for that, too. The only thing is, let's get rid of this idiocy that corporations are persons. That's not in there. That was bootlegged in, and we want to bootleg it out. We want to get it out. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That basically says the Bill of Rights and all the other protections are also binding on the states. Nor shall they deny to any person within the jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. We got to be strongly in favor of that one. Hands off. Here we have people, they claim to be conservatives who love the Constitution, and as soon as they open their yaps, they want to start tearing up the Constitution and getting their ignorant little hands all over it. The second section is that if you deprive people of their voting rights, we'll cut down your number of senators and congressmen. This came up during the Florida case in 2000, right? That if the Florida courts or this horrible woman there who was certifying that Bush had won Florida, that the answer to that, among other things, would have been to cut the number of congressmen and senators from Florida. And the third section is also very interesting. It says if you take an oath to support the United States Constitution, it means that if you've been an officer of the federal government or of any state, if you pledge to support the Constitution and then you engage in insurrection or rebellion against the U.S. government or give aid or comfort to the enemies of the U.S. government, then you're out. You can't be a senator or representative in Congress. You can't be president, vice president. You can't have any office under the U.S. government or of any state. Now, when you read that, you think of this awful Rick Perry, right, the demagogue, the tin horn character there in Texas, who, when the Tea Party came on the scene, began talking about secessionism. Under this Article 14, right, 14th Amendment, Section 3, Rick Perry could be thrown out of office. And when you read this stuff, you can see that there's a lot of interesting potential here, right? There are this Section 2 and Section 3. So, in a nutshell, hands off the 14th Amendment, you reactionaries. Don't try to roll back U.S. history. Don't try to turn back the clock to the pre-Civil War era. A lot of people died to get those guarantees put through, and we're not going to have them stripped by a bunch of yahoos out there under the manipulation of Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and a tribe of demagogues. Now, naturally, the question of the immigrants and their children. Well, the problem with that is if the child is born here in the United States, they're not citizens of the United States. What country are they citizens of? You basically are consigning them to what? To a vacuum. That they're going to be people without a country. Anyway, I don't see a problem with that. If you look at the demographic profile of the United States, you need people because there are not enough if you want to keep a functioning country. The question is, you need a minimum wage. You've got to make sure that recent immigrants are not used as strikebreakers and scabs to drive down wage levels. And above all, you need an economic recovery. Whenever you get to these social issues, right, the reactionaries love social issues, hot-button wedge issues, because they can be used to divide. There's no solution to any of these without an economic recovery, full employment, rising standards of living, and the ability, therefore, to assimilate people rapidly into a successful culture, which is a going concern. And there's the issue. Fight for the economic recovery and forget the wedge issues, the mosque in New York, the gay marriage, and the Arizona law, and Lindsey Graham's attack on the 14th Amendment. And we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. Keep up with Tarpley.net in the meantime.